Hello, and welcome to this evening's journey through time. Tonight we'll unfold another page of history and listen closely to the voices it left behind. Maybe you're lying in bed, phone screen dimmed, or maybe you've simply chosen to let the past keep you company for a while. Where are you joining me from tonight? Leave a comment if you'd like. I always enjoy hearing about your corner of the world and what time it is for you. If you find comfort in slow, thoughtful stories about the people who came before us, I'd be honoured if you subscribed. Picture this. You're walking down Drury Lane on a foggy morning in July. The usual symphony of street vendors hawking their wares has been replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the haunting cry of, "Bring out your dead," echoing from the next street over. The smell hits you first, that overwhelming stench of lime pits and rotting flesh that no amount of pomanders or herbs can mask. This isn't just some distant historical footnote we're talking about. This is the story of real people who lived through unimaginable horror, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how ordinary Londoners survived when their world literally crumbled around them. But before we dive into the nightmare that consumed London, let me give you some context that will blow your mind. The Great Plague of London wasn't just another disease outbreak. This was biological warfare on a scale that makes modern pandemics look manageable. We're talking about a city where 1 in 4 people died within a single year. That's like walking through New York City today and knowing that 2 million people around you won't be alive in 12 months. Now, I've spent countless hours diving deep into first-hand accounts, parish records, and personal diaries from this period, and what I discovered will fundamentally change how you think about human resilience. These weren't just statistics dying in the streets. These were mothers, fathers, children, merchants, and nobles, each with their own story of survival or tragic end. And their experiences reveal something profound about human nature when pushed to its absolute breaking point. Let me transport you back to that summer morning in 1665 when everything changed for the residents of London. Sarah Whitman, a baker's wife living in Bishopsgate, woke up to what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday. She had 4 children to feed, bread to bake, and customers to serve. But as she opened her shutters to let in the morning light, she noticed something that would haunt her for the rest of her days. Her neighbour's house, which just yesterday had been bustling with activity, now bore a crude red cross painted on its door with the words, "Lord have mercy upon us," scrawled beneath. That red cross wasn't graffiti or some religious symbol. It was a death sentence. It meant the plague had entered that house, and everyone inside was now condemned to die behind those walls. No one could enter. No one could leave. The house had become a tomb for the living. Sarah's hands trembled as she realized what this meant. The plague, which had been creeping through the outer parishes for months, had finally reached her neighborhood. The disease that had already decimated parts of the city was now literally next door. But here's what makes Sarah's story so incredible. Instead of fleeing like so many others, she made a decision that would define the next year of her life. She chose to stay and fight. But fighting the plague in 1665 wasn't about medicine or vaccines. It was about navigating a world where the rules of civilization had completely broken down. The streets that Sarah had walked her entire life had transformed into something unrecognizable. Where children once played, death carts now rumbled through at dawn and dusk, collecting the bodies that families left outside their doors like discarded refuse. The sound of those carts became the soundtrack of Plague London. Wooden wheels grinding against cobblestones, the creak of axles under the weight of dozens of corpses, and always, always, that terrible cry, "Bring out your dead." It was a sound that penetrated walls, invaded dreams, and reminded everyone that they might be next. Thomas Hersey, a watchman in the parish of St Giles Cripplegate, described the death carts in his journal with haunting detail. He wrote about how the cartmen, desperate for work and numbed by alcohol, would stack bodies like cordwood, sometimes piling them so high that arms and legs dangled over the sides. These weren't just anonymous corpses to Thomas. He recognized faces, knew names, remembered conversations with people who were now reduced to cargo for the lime pits. The lime pits themselves were another horror entirely. Massive trenches dug on the outskirts of the city, where hundreds of bodies were dumped each day and covered with quicklime to prevent the spread of disease. The chemical reaction between the lime and decomposing flesh created clouds of acrid smoke that could be seen for miles, a constant reminder of the scale of death consuming London. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Plague London wasn't the death. It was how quickly people adapted to it. Within weeks, seeing corpses in the street became as routine as stepping around puddles. Families developed systems for disposing of their dead relatives. Children learned to identify the symptoms of plague before they learned to read properly. Mary Toft, a seamstress living in Cheapside, kept a detailed account of her daily life during the plague months. Her entries reveal something remarkable about human psychology under extreme stress. In June, she wrote pages about the horror of seeing her first plague victim. By August, her entries became clinical, almost businesslike. Found Mrs. Henderson dead in her doorway this morning. Moved her aside to reach the baker. Bread was stale, but better than yesterday. This wasn't callousness. This was survival. The human mind's incredible ability to normalize even the most abnormal circumstances meant that Londoners could function in conditions that should have driven them insane. The taverns during this period tell their own story about human nature under pressure. Rather than closing down, many actually saw increased business as people desperately sought ways to numb their terror. The Boar's Head in Eastcheap became legendary among plague survivors for staying open throughout the entire outbreak. Its owner, William Bostock, realized that people needed a place to forget, even if just for a few hours, that they might not see another sunrise. The tavern became a strange sanctuary where the rules of normal society were suspended. Nobility sat next to street sweepers, sharing drinks and stories. Social hierarchies that had been rigidly maintained for centuries dissolved in the face of shared mortality. Everyone was equal when death could claim anyone at any moment. But the taverns also became places where the darker aspects of human nature emerged. Gambling reached fevered intensity as people wagered their remaining possessions on dice games and card tricks. Fights broke out over trivial matters because tensions were stretched beyond breaking points. Some patrons spent their last coins on ale, reasoning that dying drunk was preferable to dying sober and aware. The economic impact of the plague created its own set of horrors. As the death toll mounted, entire trades collapsed overnight. Who needed new clothes when half the population was dead or dying? Who commissioned furniture when families were abandoning their homes to flee the city? The craftsmen and merchants who formed the backbone of London's economy found themselves not just fighting disease, but fighting starvation as their livelihoods evaporated. This economic collapse led to some of the most heartbreaking stories of the plague years. Skilled artisans who had spent decades perfecting their crafts were reduced to scavenging in abandoned houses for anything they could sell. Master clockmakers became grave diggers. Respected merchants became body collectors simply because it was one of the few jobs that still paid. John Grant, a draper who would later become famous for his statistical analysis of the plague, documented how quickly London's social fabric unraveled. In his observations, he noted that by midsummer 1665, the normal mechanisms of society had essentially ceased to function. Courts closed, schools shuttered, and even churches, the traditional centers of community life, became too dangerous to enter as congregations became vectors for spreading the disease. Yet amid this breakdown, something remarkable happened. New forms of community emerged, forged not by tradition or social status, but by the shared experience of survival. Neighbors who had never spoken began checking on each other daily. Strangers shared food and medicine without expectation of repayment. Children barely had enough resources for their own survival. These orphaned by the plague were taken in by families who had incidents but part of a broader pattern of human behavior that acts of kindness weren't isolate the normal structures of society. Collapsed. People created new ones based on immediate need, and mutual AI emerged during London's darkest hour, when it revealed something profound about Aud. The plague didn't just reveal humanity's capacity for suffering, ability to find connection and meaning, even in the face of absolute devastation. The stories of survival that emerged from these connections reveal just how creative, desperate people can become. Margaret Whitfield, a widow living in Aldersgate, discovered that her late husband's collection of medical books suddenly made her one of the most valuable people in her neighbourhood. Despite having no formal training, she began treating plague symptoms with whatever remedies she could piece together from the texts. Her makeshift treatments probably saved more lives than the expensive physicians who had fled the city at the first sign of trouble. Margaret's house became an unofficial medical centre where people brought their sick relatives, not because she was qualified, but because she was willing to try. She mixed herbal concoctions in her kitchen, bled patients with rusty knives, and prayed over dying children with the same intensity that trained doctors had once reserved for wealthy patients. The remarkable thing wasn't whether her treatments worked, but that people were willing to place their lives in the hands of someone who cared more than someone who was credentialed. The children during this period developed their own ways of coping that were both heartbreaking and inspiring. Little Thomas Pepys, nephew of the famous diarist, created elaborate games with his friends where they pretended to be plague doctors, complete with makeshift leather masks stuffed with herbs. What should have been innocent childhood play became a way for 8-year-olds to process the reality that adults around them were dying faster than they could be buried. These children invented rhymes and songs about the plague that helped them remember which houses to avoid and which symptoms meant someone was beyond help. One particularly chilling verse that survived in parish records went, "Red spots upon the skin so fair means death is dancing in the air. Cross the street and hold your breath, or join the dance with Master Death." Children as young as 6 could recite this with the same casual familiarity that children today might sing nursery rhymes about rain or sunshine. The ingenuity born from desperation extended far beyond medical care and childish games. Robert Hodges, a locksmith in Fleet Street, realized that abandoned houses presented both opportunity and danger. While looters stripped these homes of obvious valuables, Robert developed a more systematic approach. He began salvaging metal fixtures, door handles, and iron fittings that others overlooked, melting them down to create new tools and implements that the surviving population desperately needed. His workshop became a hub of recycling born from necessity. Candlesticks became hammerheads, decorative ironwork became cooking pots, and ornate door knockers were transformed into simple but essential farming tools. Robert wasn't just surviving the plague, he was helping rebuild civilization one recycled piece of metal at a time. The religious response to the plague created some of the most complex moral dilemmas of the entire crisis. Father Michael Whitworth, a priest at St. Mary Le Bow, faced an impossible choice when his congregation began dying faster than he could perform last rites. Traditional Catholic doctrine demanded individual attention to each dying soul, but with dozens dying daily in his parish alone, individual care became physically impossible. Father Whitworth made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He began performing mass last rites, blessing entire rooms of dying people with a single ceremony. He justified this to himself as spiritual triage, reasoning that God would understand the circumstances, but the weight of potentially condemning souls through shortcuts in sacred ritual crushed him psychologically. His personal journals, discovered centuries later, reveal a man wrestling with questions that no theological training had prepared him to answer. Should he risk his own life to provide individual comfort to the dying, or preserve himself to serve the greater number who would need him in the weeks to come? Was it better to give abbreviated spiritual care to many, or complete care to few, while others died without any religious comfort at all? The plague also created unexpected opportunities for social mobility that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Catherine Morris, a kitchen maid in the household of a wealthy merchant, found herself inheriting an entire estate when her employer's entire family succumbed to the disease within a single week. Overnight, she transformed from someone who cleaned fireplaces to someone who owned them. But Catherine's story illustrates the double-edged nature of plague-era fortune. Yes, she gained wealth and property beyond her wildest dreams, but she also inherited the crushing responsibility of caring for the other servants who had survived. The house that had once employed 20 people now had resources to support perhaps 6, and Catherine had to decide who would stay and who would be turned out into streets where starvation and disease waited with equal hunger. These impossible decisions faced survivors throughout London. Family patriarchs who lost their wives had to choose which children to keep and which to send away. Business owners who inherited enterprises from dead partners had to determine which employees were worth saving and which were expendable. The plague didn't just kill people, it forced the living to make choices that would have been unthinkable in normal times. The development of plague etiquette reveals how quickly human societies can adapt their social norms to accommodate even the most extreme circumstances. By autumn 1665, Londoners had developed elaborate rituals around death that helped maintain some semblance of civilization. When someone died in a house, surviving family members would place a white cloth in the window to signal the death cart drivers. The body would be wrapped in whatever cloth was available and placed outside the door at sunset, ensuring collection before sunrise. These weren't ancient traditions passed down through generations. These were brand new social customs invented within months to cope with unprecedented circumstances. People created meaning and structure in a world where traditional meanings and structures had completely collapsed. The marketplace dynamics during the plague created their own form of deadly theatre. Vendors who remained in the city could charge outrageous prices for basic necessities, but they also risked their lives every day by interacting with potentially infected customers. A loaf of bread that might have cost a penny in normal times could cost a shilling during plague months, but the baker selling it might be dead before the week was out. Elizabeth Hartwell, a fishmonger in Billingsgate Market, developed an elaborate system for conducting business without direct human contact. She would lay out her fish on tables, then retreat to a safe distance while customers approached, examined the goods, and left payment in designated boxes. She would return after they left, collect the money, and clean the entire area with vinegar before the next customer arrived. This wasn't just commercial innovation. It was a survival strategy that required customers and vendors to trust each other in ways that normal commerce never demanded. People had to believe that others would pay fair prices for goods they could easily steal, and vendors had to trust that customers wouldn't deliberately spread infection to sabotage competition. The children who survived this period carried psychological scars that shaped the rest of their lives, but they also developed resilience that served them well in later years. Anne Whitmore, who was 12 when the plague struck her family, lost both parents and 3 siblings within 6 weeks. Rather than succumb to despair, she organized the other orphan children in her neighborhood into a makeshift family unit. Anne became the unofficial leader of nearly 20 children ranging in age from 4 to 15. They occupied abandoned houses, shared whatever food they could find or steal, and created their own system of rules and responsibilities. The older children protected the younger ones, while the smaller children served as scouts and messengers because they could move through the city with less suspicion. Their survival network operated like a miniature society complete with job assignments, resource sharing, and even primitive justice systems for resolving disputes. When winter approached and shelter became critical, Anne negotiated with surviving adults to provide labor in exchange for warm places to sleep. These children weren't just surviving, they were learning to thrive in conditions that had broken many adults. The psychological toll of the plague manifested in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for centuries. People developed what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress, but without any framework for understanding or treating it. Survivors reported vivid nightmares, inability to sleep without checking door locks multiple times, and irrational fears of crowds or enclosed spaces that persisted long after the danger had passed. But the most devastating psychological impact wasn't just the fear of death, it was the complete erosion of trust between human beings. When anyone could be carrying the disease, every interaction became a potential death sentence. Mothers stopped hugging their children. Husbands and wives slept in separate beds. Friends who had shared meals for decades began meeting only in open courtyards, standing 20 feet apart and shouting conversations across the distance. Jonathan Mills, a cooper who crafted barrels in Southwark, watched his trade relationships dissolve as paranoia consumed his customers. People who had trusted him with their wine and ale storage for 15 years suddenly refused to touch anything his hands had crafted. They would order barrels, then demand he leave them in designated spots and retreat before they would approach to collect them. The personal connections that had formed the foundation of his business evaporated overnight, replaced by transactions conducted like negotiations between enemy armies. This breakdown of trust created a parallel economy of fear. People began hoarding not just food and medicine, but information. If someone discovered a house where plague hadn't struck, they kept that knowledge secret rather than share it with neighbors. If a family found a reliable source of clean water or untainted grain, they guarded those discoveries like military secrets. The social bonds that had held communities together for generations snapped under the pressure of survival. The nights during plague months took on an almost supernatural quality that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. London after dark became a different city entirely, one where the normal sounds of urban life were replaced by a symphony of suffering. The groans of the dying echoed from shuttered windows. Dogs howled incessantly as they sensed death in the air. Church bells tolled so frequently for the dead that many parishes simply stopped ringing them altogether, because the sound had become too overwhelming for the living to bear. Walking through these nighttime streets required a special kind of courage. Martha Henley, a midwife who continued practicing throughout the plague, described her midnight journeys to deliver babies in terms that sound like passages through hell itself. She would navigate by memory rather than sight, keeping to the center of streets to avoid accidentally stepping on bodies that hadn't yet been collected. The smell of burning herbs from plague houses mixed with the stench of death created an atmosphere so thick she could taste it. But Martha's nighttime deliveries reveal something remarkable about human determination. Even as the world crumbled around them, people continued to create new life. Pregnant women still needed assistance bringing children into the world, even though that world seemed to offer little hope for survival. Martha delivered dozens of babies during the plague months, knowing that many of these infants would never see their first birthday. Yet she continued because life demanded to be born regardless of circumstances. The babies born during plague time faced challenges that seem almost impossible to comprehend. Many mothers died in childbirth or shortly after, leaving newborns to be raised by whoever could be found to take them. These plague babies, as they came to be known, often passed from household to household as their temporary caregivers succumbed to disease. Some infants were cared for by 5 or 6 different families before their first birthday, creating bonds of necessity rather than blood. Emma Fairfax took in 7 such babies over the course of the plague year, not because she wanted a large family, but because refusing would have meant certain death for these children. Her small house in Whitechapel became an informal nursery where she fed infants with whatever milk she could obtain, often diluted with water and honey when cow's milk became impossible to find. She lost 3 of these babies to disease, but 4 survived, and she raised them as her own children, even after the plague ended. The ingenuity required to keep infants alive during this period pushed people to extraordinary measures. When traditional baby food became unavailable, caregivers learned to pre-chew bread and meat to make it digestible for toddlers. They created makeshift diapers from scraps of cloth, salvaged from abandoned houses. They developed ways to keep babies warm in unheated buildings, by wrapping them in layers of clothing taken from plague victims, after carefully cleaning and airing the garments for days. The plague also created unexpected alliances between social classes that would have been scandalous under normal circumstances. Lady Margaret Thornfield, a nobleman's wife who chose to remain in London rather than flee to the countryside, found herself working alongside street sweepers and washerwomen to care for abandoned children. Her fine hands, which had never touched anything rougher than silk embroidery, learned to change soiled rags and spoon gruel into hungry mouths. These aristocratic women who stayed behind discovered that their wealth meant nothing when survival became the only currency that mattered. Lady Margaret's jewellery and fine dresses couldn't cure disease or fill empty stomachs, but her willingness to work alongside common people earned her a respect that no title could have provided. She became known throughout her district not as Your Ladyship, but simply as Mother Margaret, the woman who would take in any child who needed shelter. The transformation of London's physical landscape during the plague created a geography of death that survivors had to navigate daily. Entire streets became ghost towns as house after house was marked with red crosses and sealed shut. The wealthy districts of Westminster saw mansion after mansion standing empty, their grand facades hiding rooms full of corpses that wouldn't be discovered for months. But in these abandoned wealthy neighbourhoods, something unexpected happened. The poor began moving into empty mansions, not as looters, but as temporary residents seeking better shelter than their usual hovels provided. Families of street sweepers found themselves sleeping in four-poster beds and dining at mahogany tables, living like nobility while the actual nobles rotted in their country estates or lay dead in their sealed London houses. This temporary reversal of fortune created its own moral complexities. Was it theft to occupy an empty house when the owners were dead? Was it wrong to use fine china and silver when your own children were starving? These questions had no clear answers, and different families made different choices based on their own moral compass. Samuel Hartwell, a chimney sweep who moved his family into a merchant's mansion in Cheapside, spent hours each day cleaning and maintaining the house as if he were a paid caretaker rather than a squatter. He reasoned that if the owners somehow survived and returned, they would find their property in better condition than when they left it. His children learned to eat with proper utensils and sleep in clean beds, experiencing a lifestyle that would have been forever beyond their reach under normal circumstances. The markets that remained open during plague time became theatres of human drama, where desperation and commerce created strange new relationships. Vendors who had once competed fiercely with each other began sharing resources and information, recognizing that their survival depended on keeping the entire market functioning rather than driving each other out of business. Rebecca Ashford, who sold herbs and remedies in Covent Garden, formed an unlikely partnership with Thomas Wright, a butcher who had previously been her competitor for the same customers. They discovered that people seeking herbs for plague treatment often needed protein to maintain their strength, while people buying meat often desperately needed medicinal plants. Together, they created combination packages that served their customers' complete needs, while allowing both businesses to survive. This cooperation extended beyond simple business arrangements. Rebecca and Thomas began sharing the risks of their trade, taking turns exposing themselves to potentially infected customers, so that if one of them fell ill, the other could continue serving their community. They developed elaborate systems for sanitizing their shared workspace and created backup plans for caring for each other's families if the worst happened. The winter of 1665 brought new challenges that tested every survival strategy people had developed. The cold weather that normally would have provided relief from disease instead trapped people in close quarters with infected family members. Fuel for heating became scarce as delivery systems broke down, forcing families to choose between staying warm and avoiding the smoke that might carry plague vapors. Mary Goldsmith, a seamstress living near London Bridge, faced an impossible decision when her teenage son showed the first signs of plague symptoms. Traditional practice demanded that she isolate him immediately, but their tiny dwelling had no separate rooms, and the winter cold made it impossible for either of them to survive alone. She chose to care for him despite the risk, reasoning that they would either survive together or die together, but she wouldn't abandon him to face death alone. Her choice reveals something profound about human nature under extreme stress. When all the expert advice, all the official recommendations, and all the social pressure pointed toward abandoning sick family members to save yourself, many people chose love over survival. They made decisions with their hearts rather than their heads, even when their heads told them those decisions were tantamount to suicide. Mary's son recovered after 3 weeks of illness, but she contracted the plague from caring for him. As she lay dying, she felt no regret about her choice. Her final words to her neighbors were gratitude that she had been able to comfort her child during his suffering, even though that comfort cost her life. Her story became legendary in her neighborhood, not because her choice was unusual, but because it represented the choice that thousands of parents made during those dark months.
Yeah.
The spring of 1666 brought the first signs that the plague was beginning to retreat, but the damage to London's social fabric was so complete that recovery seemed impossible. Entire professions had vanished as their practitioners died or fled. Neighborhoods that had thrived for centuries stood empty except for wild dogs and rats. The intricate networks of relationships that had made city life possible needed to be rebuilt from scratch. Yet somehow, impossibly, people began that rebuilding process, even while the plague still claimed lives daily. Survivors started reaching out to other survivors, forming new households from the fragments of destroyed families. Children who had lost their parents found new guardians among neighbors who had lost their children. Widows and widowers created practical marriages based on mutual need rather than romantic love, combining their resources and skills to create viable households. The process of reconstruction revealed just how much people had learned about survival during the plague months. The improvisations and innovations born from desperation became permanent features of how London functioned. The informal networks of mutual aid that had developed during the crisis continued long after the immediate danger passed, creating a city that was more resilient and interconnected than it had been before the plague struck. But perhaps most remarkably, the children who survived carried forward a completely different understanding of what human beings were capable of enduring and overcoming. They had seen their world end and watched new worlds being born from the ashes. They had learned that civilization was both more fragile and more resilient than anyone had imagined. These lessons would shape not just their own lives, but the future of London itself. As summer approached and the death tolls finally began to decline consistently, survivors faced a new challenge that no one had anticipated during the worst of the crisis. They had to learn how to live with hope again. After months of expecting death at any moment, the possibility of a future seemed almost impossible to believe. People who had developed elaborate survival strategies had to figure out how to transition from simply staying alive to actually building lives worth living. The psychological adjustment proved as difficult as the physical survival had been. Survivors found themselves unable to make plans more than a few days ahead because planning for the future seemed like tempting fate. They hoarded resources compulsively, even when abundance returned, because the memory of scarcity remained burned into their consciousness. Most challenging of all, they had to learn how to trust other people again, how to form new relationships when everyone they had previously loved was dead. This rebuilding of human connection happened in the most unexpected places. The Mermaid Tavern in Bread Street became something of a laboratory for relearning how to be around other people. William Hodgson, the tavern keeper who had somehow survived when 3/4 of his regular customers had perished, noticed that survivors would come in but sit at separate tables, unable to engage in the casual conversation that had once filled his establishment with warmth and laughter. So William began what he called remembrance evenings, where survivors would tell stories about the people they had lost, not the gruesome details of death, but memories of life. Margaret told stories about her husband's terrible jokes. Thomas shared memories of his daughter's laugh. Slowly, tentatively, people began to remember that human connection could bring joy instead of just danger. These gatherings became so popular that other taverns throughout London began hosting similar events. The Swan in Southwark started Future Nights, where people would share their hopes for what they wanted to rebuild. The George in Borough began skill-sharing evenings, where survivors taught each other the trades and crafts they had learned from people who were no longer alive to pass on that knowledge. But the most profound healing happened in the most mundane activities. Dorothy Henshaw, a baker's widow who had learned to run the bakery herself during the plague, found that the simple act of kneading bread became a form of meditation that helped her process her grief. The rhythmic motion, the transformation of simple ingredients into something that could nourish others, gave her a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival. Her bakery became a gathering place where people would come not just for bread, but for the comfort of watching someone create something positive. Dorothy would work while customers sat on benches, sharing stories, or simply sitting in companionable silence. The act of creation, of making something that would sustain life rather than merely preventing death, provided a kind of healing that no medicine could offer. Children proved to be the most adaptable to this new world, but also the most deeply marked by their experiences. 10-year-old Peter Whitfield had survived by living with 7 different families as his caregivers died one after another. By the time the plague ended, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people's emotions and anticipate their needs, skills born from the necessity of quickly adapting to new households to ensure his own survival. Peter became invaluable to his final adoptive family, the Hendersons, because he could sense when someone was becoming ill days before symptoms appeared. He would notice subtle changes in breathing patterns, alterations in skin color, shifts in behavior that adults missed. His early warning system helped the Henderson family avoid several potentially deadly exposures. But Peter's hypervigilance came at a cost. He couldn't sleep through the night without checking on every member of the household multiple times. He hoarded food under his bed, even when the pantry was full. He flinched when people approached him too quickly, and he had developed elaborate rituals around cleanliness that bordered on obsessive. The skills that had kept him alive during the plague made normal childhood nearly impossible once the danger passed. The Henderson family, recognizing Peter's struggles, developed creative ways to help him feel secure, while slowly encouraging more normal behavior. They established predictable daily routines that gave him a sense of control. They let him maintain some of his survival behaviors, like keeping a small stash of food in his room, while gradually introducing activities that had nothing to do with staying alive. Mrs. Henderson taught Peter to draw, reasoning that creating pictures required him to focus on something beautiful rather than constantly scanning for danger. Mr. Henderson involved him in woodworking projects that produced items for pleasure rather than necessity. Slowly, Peter began to remember that life could involve activities beyond survival, but the process took years and required extraordinary patience from his new family. The economic recovery of London created opportunities that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Entire industries had to be rebuilt from nothing, and the people who remained often found themselves in positions of influence they never could have achieved in the pre-plague world. Alice Morrison, who had been a kitchen servant before the plague, discovered that her practical experience managing household resources during the crisis made her invaluable to wealthy families returning to London. Alice became what we might now call a household consultant, helping returning nobles figure out how to restore their estates and manage their properties. She knew which local suppliers had survived, which tradesmen were reliable, and most importantly, how to create efficient systems for running large households, with fewer servants than had been available before the plague. Her success allowed her to purchase her own small house, something that would have been impossible for a kitchen servant under the old system. But Alice's rise in status came with its own challenges. Former peers resented her success, while the wealthy families she served sometimes treated her with suspicion, unsure how to relate to someone who had crossed class boundaries so dramatically. The religious landscape of London underwent its own transformation as survivors struggled to make sense of what they had endured. Father Edmund Walsh, who had administered last rites to hundreds of plague victims, found that his traditional theological training provided few answers to the questions his surviving parishioners brought to him. Why had some people survived while others died? What was the meaning of suffering on such a scale? How could a loving God allow such devastation? Rather than offering easy answers, Father Walsh began what he called questioning services, where parishioners could voice their doubts and anger without fear of judgment. These sessions became incredibly popular, drawing people who had stopped attending regular church services because traditional prayers felt inadequate to address their experiences. The questioning services revealed that many survivors had developed their own personal theologies during the plague months. Some believed they had been spared for a special purpose. Others felt guilty for surviving when better people had died. Many had lost their faith entirely, while a few had found deeper spiritual meaning in their suffering. Father Walsh discovered that his most important role wasn't providing answers, but creating a safe space where people could wrestle with questions that had no easy solutions. His church became a place where doubt was welcome alongside faith, where anger at God was acknowledged as a valid response to trauma, and where the community could support each other through the long process of making meaning from their experiences. The physical rebuilding of London required innovations that drew on lessons learned during the plague. Architects and city planners recognized that the cramped, poorly ventilated buildings that had facilitated the spread of disease needed to be replaced with structures that prioritized public health alongside functionality. Christopher Wren, the famous architect, began incorporating wider streets and better ventilation into his designs, partly because of observations made during the plague about how disease spread through crowded areas. But these improvements came at a cost that fell disproportionately on the poor, who found themselves priced out of areas they had lived in for generations, as new construction favored wealthy residents who could afford modern amenities. The displacement created by rebuilding efforts forced plague survivors to form new communities in areas of London that had been less affected by the disease. These new neighbourhoods developed their own unique character, shaped by the shared experiences of people who had lost everything and were starting over together. Mary Fletcher, who had lost her husband and 2 children during the plague, moved to one of these new communities in Stepney with her surviving daughter. She found herself part of a neighbourhood where almost everyone had similar stories of loss and survival. The shared understanding created bonds that transcended the traditional social divisions that had previously separated people. In Mary's new neighbourhood, a former merchant's wife lived next door to a blacksmith's widow. A nobleman's daughter who had been disinherited when her family died shared a garden with a tavern keeper's mother. These unlikely neighbours found that their common experiences of trauma and recovery created a foundation for relationships that were deeper and more authentic than many of the connections they had formed in their previous lives. The children in these new communities developed their own culture that reflected their unique experiences. They created games that helped them process their trauma while building resilience for the future. They invented stories and songs that celebrated survival rather than mourning death. Most importantly, they formed friendships based on mutual understanding of what it meant to lose everything and keep going. Jenny Morrison and Tom Bradley, both orphaned by the plague, became inseparable friends who developed their own secret language for communicating about their experiences. They had words for different types of nightmares, phrases for describing the feeling of missing someone who was dead, and signals for when one of them needed comfort without having to ask directly. Their friendship became a template for how other plague-orphaned children learned to support each other. They developed systems for sharing resources, created rituals for marking important dates like the anniversaries of their parents' deaths, and most importantly, they learned to create new traditions that honored their past while building hope for their future. The markets and commercial districts that slowly reopened had to accommodate customers who had been fundamentally changed by their experiences. Shopkeepers noticed that survivors approached purchasing decisions differently than people had before the plague. They were more cautious about crowds, more deliberate about their choices, and more likely to form intense loyalty to vendors who had remained reliable during the crisis. Thomas Hartwell, who had continued operating his cloth shop throughout the plague, found that his customer base had completely transformed. The wealthy clients who had once formed the foundation of his business had either died or fled London permanently. But the working-class customers who had remained loyal during the crisis now had more disposable income because they had inherited property or taken over businesses from plague victims. Thomas had to completely reimagine his business model, learning to serve customers who valued durability and practicality over luxury and fashion. He began stocking simpler, more functional clothing that could serve multiple purposes, recognizing that his customers had learned to prioritize utility over ornamentation. But Thomas also noticed that his customers were hungry for small luxuries that reminded them life could still contain beauty. A colorful ribbon, a piece of decorative trim, or a soft fabric that felt pleasant against the skin became precious to people who had spent months focused solely on survival. These small indulgences represented hope that life could once again include pleasure alongside necessity. The integration of plague survivors with Londoners who were returning after fleeing the city created tensions that nobody had anticipated. The returnees often expected to resume their previous lives as if nothing had changed, while the survivors had been fundamentally transformed by their experiences and had created new ways of living that they were reluctant to abandon. Lady Catherine Pemberton returned to her London mansion after spending the plague year at her country estate to find that her house had been occupied by 3 families of plague survivors who had maintained and improved the property during her absence. Rather than simply evicting them, Lady Catherine found herself in a complex negotiation about what constituted fair compensation for their care of her property and what obligation she had to people who had preserved her wealth while she was safe in the countryside. The solution they developed became a model for similar situations throughout London. The surviving families remained in the house as permanent residents, but as employees rather than squatters. Lady Catherine converted her mansion into a combination of private residence and boarding house, with the former squatters serving as housekeepers, cooks, and groundskeepers in exchange for permanent housing and wages. This arrangement benefited everyone involved. Lady Catherine had reliable staff who knew her property intimately and were grateful for the opportunity to formalise their residence. The survivor families gained security and legitimate employment. Most importantly, the arrangement created a household where pre-plague social distinctions were softened by shared investment in making the arrangement work. The children in these mixed households developed particularly interesting relationships that reflected the social fluidity created by the plague. Young Lord Pemberton, Lady Catherine's son, found himself learning practical skills from children who had survived on the streets during the plague, while the survivor children gained access to formal education and cultural refinement that had previously been reserved for the nobility. These children created their own hybrid culture that combined aristocratic manners with street survival skills, formal education with practical knowledge, and traditional values with the hard-won wisdom that came from experiencing society's complete breakdown and reconstruction. The long-term psychological effects of the plague began to manifest in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for generations. Many survivors developed what we might now recognize as agoraphobia, becoming unable to tolerate crowds or enclosed spaces. Others became compulsive cleaners, unable to feel safe unless their environment was scrubbed constantly with vinegar and herbs. But perhaps the most significant lasting change was in how people thought about time and planning. Survivors had learned to live completely in the present during the plague, because planning for the future seemed pointless when death could come at any moment. Transitioning back to making long-term plans required a conscious effort that many found surprisingly difficult. Elizabeth Thornton, who had survived by taking each day as it came during the plague, found herself unable to commit to social engagements more than a week in advance, even months after the danger had passed. The idea of promising to attend a dinner party next month seemed presumptuous, as if she were tempting fate by assuming she would still be alive. Elizabeth's struggle was common among survivors, who had to consciously retrain themselves to believe in the possibility of a future. They had to practice making plans, starting with small commitments and gradually working up to larger ones. They had to learn to trust that tomorrow would come, that next week was worth preparing for, and that next year was worth dreaming about. The process of rebuilding hope proved to be as challenging as any of the practical aspects of recovery. Hope required vulnerability, the willingness to risk disappointment by believing that things could get better. For people who had watched their entire world collapse, that vulnerability felt dangerous, as if hoping for good things might somehow invite disaster. Yet slowly, incrementally, hope began to return to London. It started with small things: a merchant restocking his shop with goods he expected to sell next month, a woman planting flowers she believed she would see bloom in spring, a couple making plans for a wedding they assumed would actually take place. The return of hope manifested most clearly in decisions about children. During the plague, many survivors had avoided having children, reasoning that bringing new life into such a dangerous world was cruel. But as the death tolls dropped and stayed low, couples began planning families again, making the ultimate statement of faith in the future. Sarah and David Whitmore, who had postponed their wedding during the plague, finally married in the spring of 1667. Their wedding became a community celebration that went far beyond the usual ceremony, because it represented the community's collective decision to believe in the future. Neighbors who had been strangers before the plague contributed food, music, and decorations, creating a celebration that honored not just the couple's union, but everyone's survival and recovery. The wedding feast lasted 3 days and included people from every social class who had survived the plague in their neighborhood. Former servants danced with former masters. Children who had been orphaned by the plague served as flower girls and ring bearers, and the ceremony itself included prayers of gratitude for survival alongside traditional wedding vows. But perhaps the most meaningful part of the celebration was a ritual the community had developed for honoring the dead while celebrating the living. Each guest brought a small memento representing someone they had lost during the plague. These items were blessed during the ceremony and then buried together in the garden of the newlyweds' home, creating a memorial that acknowledged loss while consecrating new beginnings. The garden became a pilgrimage site of sorts for other plague survivors, who would come to sit among the flowers and remember their own dead while drawing hope from the new life growing around the memorial. The couple's first child was born the following spring, and neighbors remarked that the baby seemed to thrive in the garden, as if drawing strength from the love and memory buried in its soil. As 1667 progressed, London began to attract visitors from other parts of England and Europe who came to witness the city's recovery. These visitors often commented on the unique character of post-plague London, noting that the city seemed both more somber and more joyful than other places they had known. The sobriety came from the ever-present awareness of mortality that survivors carried with them. People valued time differently when they had seen how quickly it could be taken away. They were more deliberate in their choices, more grateful for simple pleasures, and more conscious of the fragility of all human arrangements. But the joy was equally intense, precisely because it had been so hard-won. Survivors celebrated ordinary moments with an intensity that seemed excessive to outsiders, but felt entirely appropriate to people who had learned not to take any moment for granted. A successful harvest, a child's laughter, a friend's recovery from illness, a beautiful sunset, all became occasions for gratitude that bordered on reverence. This combination of sobriety and intensity created a cultural atmosphere unlike anywhere else in Europe. London had become a city of people who knew exactly how precious life was because they had watched so much of it disappear. They had learned to hold hope and despair simultaneously, to plan for the future while treasuring the present, and to love deeply while accepting that loss was inevitable. The children who grew up in this environment developed characteristics that would influence London's culture for generations. They were simultaneously more cautious and more adventurous than previous generations, more aware of danger, but also more willing to take risks for things that mattered. They valued security, but were also comfortable with uncertainty, having learned that even the most stable-seeming situations could change instantly. Most importantly, they had learned that human beings were capable of surviving almost anything, and that communities could be rebuilt even after complete devastation. This knowledge made them both more resilient and more compassionate, more willing to help others because they understood that anyone might need help, and that today's helper might be tomorrow's person in need of assistance. The London that emerged from the plague was not the same city that had existed before 1665, nor could it ever be. Too much had been lost, too much had changed. Too many people had been transformed by their experiences for a simple return to the old ways to be possible. But what emerged was in many ways a better city, one that had learned profound lessons about human resilience, community solidarity, and the preciousness of life itself. The plague had stripped away many of the artificial barriers that had divided people, revealing the fundamental humanity that connected all residents of the city, regardless of their birth or circumstances. The recovery process had required cooperation across all social lines, creating new forms of community that were more inclusive and more authentic than the traditional hierarchies they replaced. Yet even as the city rebuilt and prospered, the memory of those dark months remained embedded in its consciousness. The red crosses had been painted over, the death carts had been retired, the lime pits had been filled and planted with grass. But the lessons learned during humanity's darkest hour continued to shape how Londoners understood themselves, their city, and their obligations to one another. The Great Plague of London had ended, but its legacy would endure for centuries, carried forward by survivors who had learned that even when the world ends, it can begin again, and that human beings possess reserves of strength, creativity, and love that can overcome even the most devastating circumstances. They had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and emerged not unscathed, but transformed, carrying with them hard-won wisdom about what it truly means to be human in the face of unimaginable adversity. The spring of 1667 brought something London hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. Children playing in the streets without adults hovering nervously nearby, watching for the first signs of fever or swollen glands. But these weren't the same carefree games that had filled London's alleys before the plague struck. These children had invented entirely new forms of play that reflected their extraordinary experiences. Little Margaret Simmons, now 8 years old, had spent the plague months moving between 7 different households as her caregivers died one by one. She had developed an uncanny ability to assess people's health within moments of meeting them, a skill that had kept her alive when adults failed to recognize danger. Now, in the relative safety of recovery, Margaret organized elaborate games where children would pretend to diagnose each other's imaginary ailments, creating detailed treatments using flower petals and pond water. What appeared to be innocent childhood play was actually a sophisticated form of trauma processing. These children were working through their experiences by transforming the terror they had lived through into something they could control and master. Margaret's games allowed her friends to practice the survival skills they had learned while gradually releasing the hypervigilance that had exhausted them for months. The adults watching these games felt a complex mixture of pride and heartbreak. They were amazed by the resilience and creativity their children displayed, but also deeply saddened that such young people had needed to develop these coping mechanisms. Mary Simmons, Margaret's adoptive mother, often found herself weeping as she watched her daughter teach other children how to identify plague symptoms, knowing that no 8-year-old should possess such knowledge. But Mary also recognized that Margaret's unusual skills had value beyond their original survival function. The child's ability to read people's health and emotional state made her an invaluable helper in their household. Margaret could sense when someone was becoming ill days before symptoms appeared, allowing the family to take preventive measures. More importantly, she could detect when someone was struggling emotionally, often providing comfort to adults who were too proud to admit they needed support. The transformation of London's commercial districts revealed just how thoroughly the plague had reshuffled the city's economic landscape. Fleet Street, once dominated by wealthy goldsmiths and luxury merchants, now bustled with practical trades that had become essential during the crisis. Blacksmiths, who had once crafted decorative ironwork, now specialized in sturdy locks and security devices. Tailors, who had previously focused on fashionable clothing, now made durable work garments designed to last through multiple owners. Robert Ashford had been apprenticed to a goldsmith before the plague struck, learning to create ornate jewellery for London's elite. When his master died and the demand for luxury goods evaporated, Robert found himself with skills that seemed useless in the new London. But he discovered that the same precision and attention to detail required for jewellery could be applied to creating medical instruments that the city desperately needed. Robert began crafting surgical tools, syringes for administering medicines, and precision scales for measuring herbs and compounds. His goldsmith's training in working with precious metals proved invaluable when creating instruments that needed to be both durable and easily cleaned. Within a year, Robert had established himself as one of London's most sought-after medical instrument makers, serving physicians who were returning to the city and discovering that their old equipment had been lost or contaminated during the plague. But Robert's success came with an unexpected emotional cost. Every instrument he created was designed to fight disease and save lives, a constant reminder of all the lives that had been lost when such tools weren't available. He found himself working with an intensity that bordered on obsession, driven by the irrational belief that perfecting his craft might somehow retroactively save the people who had died during the plague. His wife, Eleanor, worried about Robert's inability to rest or take pleasure in his success. She watched him work late into the night, polishing surgical instruments to a mirror shine, testing and retesting the mechanisms of syringes, obsessing over details that no one else would notice. Eleanor recognized that Robert was trying to heal his own trauma through his work, attempting to create tools that could prevent future suffering, as a way of making peace with the suffering he had been powerless to prevent. The reconstruction of London's religious life proved even more complex than its economic recovery. Churches that had been abandoned during the plague needed to be reconsecrated, but many contained reminders of the crisis that made normal worship difficult. St. Margaret's in Westminster still showed stains on its walls where bodies had been stacked when the churchyard overflowed. All Saints in Cheapside bore scorch marks from the fires that had been lit to purify the air. Father Thomas Whitfield returned to his parish of St. Botolph to find that his congregation had been reduced from over 300 families to fewer than 50. But those who remained had been bound together by shared experiences that created a spiritual intimacy he had never encountered in traditional religious settings. They had prayed together over dying children, had shared their last food with strangers, and had found ways to maintain hope when hope seemed impossible. Father Thomas discovered that his surviving parishioners needed a different kind of spiritual guidance than they had required before the plague. Traditional sermons about abstract theological concepts felt inadequate to address the concrete experiences of loss and survival that defined their lives. Instead, he began incorporating the stories of their own experiences into his services, treating their survival narratives as modern parables that revealed divine truth through human endurance. The Sunday services at St. Botolph became legendary throughout London for their emotional intensity and practical wisdom. People would travel from distant parishes to hear Father Thomas weave together scripture and survival stories, creating worship experiences that acknowledged both the darkness they had endured and the light they had found within it. The church became a place where doubt and faith could coexist, where anger at God was understood as a form of prayer, and where the community's shared trauma became a foundation for deeper spiritual connection. But Father Thomas also struggled with his own spiritual crisis that he kept hidden from his congregation. He had watched innocent children die while evil people survived. He had seen prayers go unanswered, while coincidence seemed to determine who lived and who died. His faith had been shaken to its core, and he often felt like a fraud offering comfort to others when his own beliefs felt uncertain. The solution came through an unexpected source. Old Mrs. Pemberton, an elderly widow who had lost her entire family during the plague, approached Father Thomas after a particularly difficult service, where he had struggled to explain why God allowed suffering. Instead of seeking comfort, she offered him wisdom that would reshape his understanding of ministry. She told him that his doubt made him more qualified to minister to others, not less. People who had watched their world collapse didn't need a priest who had easy answers, she explained. They needed someone who could sit with them in their questions, who could acknowledge that faith sometimes meant believing despite evidence to the contrary, and who could find meaning in mystery rather than demanding certainty from tragedy. Mrs. Pemberton's words liberated Father Thomas from the burden of having to understand everything that had happened. He began preaching about the holiness of uncertainty, the sacredness of questions that had no answers, and the way that faith could deepen rather than weaken in the face of inexplicable loss. His honesty about his own struggles created space for his parishioners to be honest about theirs, transforming St. Botolph into a place where spiritual healing could begin. The markets of London developed their own unique rhythm as survivors, and returnees negotiated new relationships around commerce and trust. Leadenhall Market became a fascinating laboratory for observing how people's approach to trade had been altered by their experiences. Customers who had survived the plague shopped with a deliberateness that seemed almost ritualistic, carefully examining goods and building relationships with vendors that went far beyond simple transactions. Martha Hensley, who sold vegetables and herbs, noticed that her plague survivor customers wanted to know the story behind everything they purchased. Where had the vegetables been grown? Who had tended them? What conditions had they been stored in? These weren't just practical questions about quality. They were attempts to create connection and meaning around the most basic activities of daily life. Martha began telling elaborate stories about her produce, describing the farmers who grew the vegetables, the weather conditions that had influenced the harvest, and the journey the goods had taken to reach her stall. Her customers would listen intently to these narratives, often asking follow-up questions that revealed their deep hunger for connection and context that went beyond mere commerce. The relationships Martha formed with her customers became so personal that her stall began functioning almost like an informal community centre. People would come to buy vegetables but stay to share news about their families, seek advice about their problems, and offer help to other customers who were struggling. Martha found herself serving as counsellor, matchmaker, and community organizer, roles that had emerged naturally from her willingness to treat each transaction as an opportunity for human connection. But the intensity of these relationships also created challenges that Martha hadn't anticipated. When customers became friends, their problems became her problems. She found herself lending money to people who couldn't afford vegetables for their children, storing goods for customers who had nowhere safe to keep them, and mediating disputes between customers who had become too emotionally invested in their market relationships. The summer of 1667 brought London's first major celebration since before the plague began. The city organised a festival to commemorate the official end of the crisis and to honour those who had died. But planning the celebration revealed deep divisions about how the plague should be remembered and what lessons should be drawn from the experience. Some survivors wanted a solemn memorial that focused on honouring the dead and acknowledging the suffering that had been endured. Others pushed for a joyous celebration that emphasised resilience and recovery, arguing that the dead would be better honoured by celebrating life than by dwelling on death. Still others wanted to use the occasion to address the social changes that had emerged from the crisis, officially recognising new forms of community and cooperation that had developed during the emergency. The committee organising the festival included representatives from every social class and neighbourhood that had been affected by the plague. Lady Margaret Thornfield sat alongside street sweeper William Hodges and tavern keeper Sarah Whitman, trying to create an event that would satisfy the diverse needs and perspectives of London's survivors. The discussions revealed how differently people had experienced and interpreted the same crisis. Wealthy survivors who had fled to the countryside and returned wanted to restore traditional social hierarchies and pretend the plague had been a temporary interruption rather than a transformative experience. Working-class survivors who had remained in the city and taken over abandoned properties wanted recognition of their sacrifices and validation of the new social arrangements they had created. The children who had survived the plague had their own ideas about how it should be commemorated. They wanted activities that acknowledged their unique experiences and contributions, not just ceremonies designed by and for adults. 10-year-old Thomas Morrison, who had organised other orphaned children during the crisis, presented a proposal for a children's parade where young survivors would demonstrate the skills they had learned and tell their own stories. The compromise solution satisfied no one completely, but included elements that spoke to everyone's needs. The festival would last 3 days, beginning with a solemn memorial service, continuing with community celebrations that showcased new forms of cooperation, and ending with a children's parade that looked toward the future rather than dwelling on the past. The memorial service revealed the depth of loss that London had endured. When people began reading the names of the dead, the list went on for hours. Entire families were represented by single survivors. Some neighbourhoods had lost so many residents that the survivors could name every person who had died. The magnitude of the loss became overwhelming as the names continued, creating a shared recognition of just how close London had come to complete destruction. But the memorial service also revealed the unexpected ways that death had created new forms of connection among the living. People found themselves comforting strangers who mourned the same people they mourned. Survivors who had never met discovered they had cared for the same orphaned children or had inherited responsibilities from the same deceased neighbours. The reading of names became a way of mapping the invisible networks of care and connection that had held the city together during its darkest months. The community celebrations showcased innovations that had emerged from necessity during the plague, but had evolved into permanent features of London life. Neighbourhoods that had developed shared gardens and communal kitchens during the crisis continued these cooperative arrangements because they had proven both practical and socially rewarding. Households that had combined resources to survive now chose to maintain their extended family structures because they preferred the security and companionship of larger groups. The most remarkable displays featured children demonstrating skills they had learned during the plague that had no peacetime equivalent. 12-year-old Anne Whitmore showed how she had taught younger children to identify safe water sources and avoid contaminated areas. 8-year-old Peter Hartwell demonstrated the elaborate hand-washing rituals he had developed to prevent disease transmission. These children had become experts in survival techniques that adults hoped would never be needed again, but that represented invaluable knowledge about human adaptability and resilience. The final day's children's parade became the emotional climax of the entire festival. The young survivors had created costumes and floats that told their stories through symbolism rather than literal representation. They carried banners celebrating the adults who had cared for them, flowers honoring the friends they had lost, and handmade toys representing the childhood they had been forced to abandon and were now trying to reclaim. The parade route took the children through neighborhoods where they had lived during the plague, allowing them to revisit sites of trauma that were now being transformed into places of memory and hope. When they passed the location of former death pits, they threw flower petals and sang songs they had composed about the people buried there. When they walked by houses that had been sealed with red crosses, they rang small bells to celebrate the fact that those houses were now occupied by living families. The adult spectators watching the parade found themselves experiencing a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in the children's resilience was mixed with grief for the innocence they had lost. Joy at seeing them celebrate life was tempered by sorrow that such young people had needed to develop such sophisticated coping mechanisms. Hope for their future was shadowed by worry about the long-term effects of their traumatic experiences. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when the children invited adults to join them for the final portion of the parade. Survivors who had been separated by class, profession, and neighborhood found themselves walking together behind children who had learned to see past such artificial distinctions. The procession became a living symbol of the new London that had emerged from the plague, one where shared experiences of loss and recovery created bonds that transcended traditional social divisions. The festival's success led to its establishment as an annual tradition that continued for decades, evolving over time to meet the changing needs of London's survivors and their descendants. Each year's celebration incorporated new elements that reflected how people's understanding of their experiences had deepened, how their healing had progressed, and how the lessons of the plague continued to influence their choices and values. But the festival also revealed tensions that would persist long after the immediate crisis had passed. Survivors struggled with how much of their traumatic experiences to share with children who had been born after the plague, how to pass on the lessons they had learned without burdening the next generation with their fears, and how to maintain the community bonds that had been forged in crisis without requiring ongoing crisis to sustain them. The autumn of 1667 brought London's first normal harvest season since before the plague began. The restoration of regular agricultural cycles represented more than just economic recovery. It symbolized the return of predictable rhythms to lives that had been dominated by chaos and uncertainty for nearly 2 years. But even this return to normalcy carried reminders of how much had changed. Elizabeth Fairmont, who had inherited a small farm outside London when her employer's entire family died during the plague, found herself responsible for crops she had never planted and livestock she had never tended. Her transformation from kitchen servant to farm owner would have been impossible under normal circumstances, but the plague had created opportunities that existed nowhere else in Europe. Elizabeth's success as a farmer came not from traditional agricultural knowledge, which she lacked, but from the practical skills she had developed during the plague. She had learned to make careful observations about health and sickness that translated perfectly to monitoring plant and animal welfare. Her experience managing scarce resources during the crisis made her incredibly efficient at maximizing crop yields and minimizing waste. But Elizabeth's rise from servant to landowner created social complications that she struggled to navigate. Former peers resented her success, while established farmers questioned her right to own land that had traditionally been reserved for men from agricultural families. She found herself caught between worlds, too elevated for her original social class, but not fully accepted by her new one. The solution came through forming partnerships with other plague survivors who had experienced similar social mobility. Elizabeth joined forces with Robert Whitman, a former apprentice who had inherited his master's blacksmith shop, and Catherine Morris, a former maid who had taken over a textile business. Together, They created an informal network of new business owners who supported each other's ventures and provided the social acceptance they couldn't find elsewhere. Their alliance became a model for other survivors who had experienced dramatic changes in fortune. They developed systems for sharing knowledge, resources, and customers that allowed each business to thrive while creating a support network that replaced the traditional guild structures that had excluded them. Their success demonstrated that the social changes created by the plague could be sustained and institutionalized, rather than simply tolerated as temporary emergency measures. The winter of 1667 marked London's first cold season since the plague ended, creating anxiety among survivors who associated winter with increased mortality and resource scarcity. The shortened days and confined indoor living that had once been merely inconvenient now triggered memories of the months when such conditions had meant death for thousands of families. Dr. William Harvey, one of the few physicians who had remained in London throughout the plague, noticed that many of his patients developed symptoms that seemed more psychological than physical as winter approached. They reported difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, and persistent anxiety that had no clear medical cause. Dr. Harvey realized he was observing what we might now recognize as seasonal affective disorder, complicated by trauma-related triggers. Dr. Harvey began treating these patients not just with traditional medicine, but with what he called memory healing techniques that helped them distinguish between past danger and present safety. He encouraged patients to create new winter rituals that celebrated survival, rather than focusing on the threat of death. He organized group activities that brought survivors together during the darkest months, providing social connection that countered the isolation that had been so deadly during the plague. His most innovative treatment involved helping patients create what he termed safety anchors, physical objects or activities that reminded them of their current security when memories of past danger became overwhelming. Sarah Whitman carried a small piece of soap that she would smell when anxiety struck, reminding herself that she now had access to cleanliness and hygiene that had been impossible during the plague. Thomas Bradley wore a brass button from his father's coat that reminded him he was connected to family history that extended beyond the plague years. These simple techniques proved remarkably effective at helping survivors manage what Dr. Harvey recognized as the normal psychological after-effects of extreme trauma. His success led to the establishment of London's first systematic approach to treating what would later be understood as post-traumatic stress, though the terminology wouldn't exist for centuries. The approach of 1668 brought a new challenge that no one had anticipated. London was running out of space to accommodate the people who wanted to move there. Word had spread throughout England and continental Europe about the opportunities available in a city that was rebuilding from scratch, attracting migrants who hoped to benefit from London's labour shortages and social mobility. But the influx of newcomers created tensions with plague survivors who felt that outsiders were benefiting from opportunities that rightfully belonged to the people who had endured the crisis. Competition for housing, jobs, and resources became intense as the city's population began to exceed its pre-plague levels for the first time since the crisis began. The tensions came to a head in the spring of 1668, when a group of French immigrants attempted to establish a textile workshop in Spitalfields, competing directly with businesses owned by plague survivors. Local residents organised protests arguing that foreigners had no right to profit from London's recovery when local people had sacrificed so much to make that recovery possible. The conflict revealed deep questions about who had earned the right to participate in London's renewal and what obligations the city had to different groups of people. Did plague survivors deserve preferential treatment in recognition of their suffering and sacrifice? Should opportunities be distributed based on need, merit, or simple market forces? How could London grow and prosper while honouring the experiences of the people who had preserved it during its darkest hour? The resolution came through a compromise that established quotas ensuring that a certain percentage of new business licenses went to plague survivors, while still allowing newcomers to contribute to the city's growth. The system wasn't perfect and satisfied no one completely, but it provided a framework for managing the tensions between honouring the past and embracing the future that would influence London's development for decades to come. More importantly, the conflict forced London's residents to articulate what they had learned from their experiences and what values they wanted to preserve as their city evolved. The discussions revealed a remarkable consensus about the importance of community support, social mobility based on contribution rather than birth, and the obligation of those who had been fortunate to help those who were struggling. These values, forged in the crucible of the plague years, became embedded in London's culture in ways that distinguished it from other European cities. Visitors often commented on Londoners' unusual willingness to help strangers, their relative lack of rigid class distinctions, and their pragmatic approach to solving problems that prioritized effectiveness over tradition. The children who had survived the plague were now becoming teenagers, with perspectives shaped by experiences that no previous generation had endured. They approached adolescence with a maturity that impressed adults, but also concerned parents who worried that their children had been forced to grow up too quickly. 15-year-old Margaret Morrison had been only 8 when the plague began, but she had learned to take care of younger children, manage household resources, and make life and death decisions that most adults never faced. Now, as she approached adulthood, Margaret struggled to relate to teenagers who had never experienced such responsibility and who seemed childish and frivolous in comparison. Margaret's parents, who had adopted her during the plague after her birth family died, found themselves dealing with a teenager who was simultaneously more mature and more emotionally fragile than they knew how to handle. Margaret could manage complex household responsibilities with skill that surpassed many adults, but she would break down crying if separated from her adoptive family for more than a few hours. The solution came through connecting Margaret with other plague survivor teenagers who shared similar experiences and challenges. Together, they formed what might be called London's first peer support group, meeting regularly to discuss their experiences and help each other navigate the transition from survival mode to normal adolescence. These teenagers developed their own culture that blended extraordinary maturity with age-appropriate activities. They organized elaborate parties that included both sophisticated discussions about philosophy and religion and childish games they had missed during the plague years. They created courtship rituals that acknowledged their unusual experiences while still allowing for the romantic experimentation that was normal for their age group. Most importantly, they began to see their plague experiences not as trauma that had damaged them, but as preparation that had equipped them with unique skills and perspectives that would serve them well throughout their lives. They had learned to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, to find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems, and to form deep connections with people from all walks of life. As London entered 1669, nearly 4 years after the plague began, the city had achieved something that had seemed impossible during the darkest months of the crisis. It had not merely recovered from devastation, it had been transformed into something new and arguably better than what had existed before. The forced social mixing created by the emergency had broken down barriers that had persisted for centuries. The practical innovations born from necessity had improved daily life for people at every social level. Most importantly, the shared experience of survival had created bonds of community that were deeper and more inclusive than traditional social structures had ever provided. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement was how London's residents had managed to honour their traumatic experiences without being defined or limited by them. They had found ways to remember the dead without being paralysed by grief, to acknowledge their suffering without wallowing in victimhood, and to celebrate their survival without forgetting the cost of their deliverance. The London that emerged from the Great Plague was a city that understood both the fragility and the resilience of human civilization. Its residents had learned that everything they took for granted could disappear overnight, but also that human beings possessed almost unlimited capacity for adaptation, cooperation, and renewal when circumstances demanded it. These lessons would echo through London's history for centuries to come. influencing how the city responded to future crises and shaping the character of its residents in ways that distinguished London from other great cities of the world. The plague had tested London and its people to their absolute limits, and they had not merely survived the test, but had emerged stronger, wiser, and more deeply connected to one another than they had ever been before. The streets that had once echoed with the cry of "Bring out your dead" now rang with the laughter of children, the conversations of neighbours, and the sounds of commerce and community that indicated a city fully alive. The red crosses had been painted over, the death carts had been retired, and the lime pits had been transformed into gardens where flowers grew in soil that had once received the bodies of plague victims. Yet the memory of those dark months remained embedded in London's consciousness, not as a source of trauma, but as a reminder of what human beings could endure and overcome when they faced the ultimate test together. The plague had revealed both the worst and the best of human nature, and London had chosen to build its future on the foundation of the best, creating a legacy that would inspire and guide the city through whatever challenges lay ahead. The transformation of London's food systems during the plague years reveals just how quickly desperation can breed innovation. When traditional supply chains collapsed and familiar vendors disappeared overnight, survivors had to reimagine the most basic aspects of staying alive. The story of how people fed themselves and their families during these months showcases human ingenuity at its most essential level. Agnes Hartwell had run a small bakery in Aldgate for over a decade when the plague struck her neighbourhood. Her husband had died in the second wave, and her teenage son had fled to the countryside with most of their neighbours. Agnes faced a choice that would define the rest of her life: abandon her bakery and join the exodus, or stay and serve the desperate people who had nowhere else to go. Agnes chose to stay, but staying meant solving problems no baker had ever faced before. Her usual suppliers of flour and grain had either died or stopped making deliveries to plague districts. The ovens that had once produced delicate pastries for wealthy customers now needed to maximize nutrition from whatever ingredients she could scavenge or barter. Most challenging of all, she had to serve customers while maintaining the distance that might mean the difference between life and death. Her solution transformed not just her business, but the entire concept of how food could be distributed during a crisis. Agnes began what she called doorstep baking, where customers would leave containers outside their homes along with whatever ingredients they could provide. She would collect these offerings during her morning rounds, combine ingredients from multiple households to create basic bread and porridge, then return the finished food to the same doorsteps before noon. This system meant that families who had only a handful of grain could still eat bread by sharing resources with neighbours who had salt or yeast or fuel for cooking. Agnes became not just a baker, but a coordinator of community resources, making sure that nothing edible was wasted and that even the poorest families received something nutritious every day. The success of Agnes's system inspired similar arrangements throughout London. Margaret Whitfield, who had been a scullery maid in a great house before the plague, discovered that her knowledge of large-scale cooking could serve entire neighbourhoods rather than just wealthy families. She organised communal kitchens in abandoned courtyards where people could bring whatever food they had and share in meals that were more nutritious and satisfying than anything they could have prepared individually. These communal kitchens became more than just places to eat. They evolved into the social centres of their neighbourhoods. People lingered after meals to share news about which areas were safe, which houses had been abandoned, and which survivors might need help. Children played together, while adults planned cooperative ventures. Romances bloomed between widows and widowers, who discovered compatibility over shared bowls of Margaret's hearty stews. But the communal kitchens also revealed the complex social negotiations required when traditional hierarchies collapsed. Lady Catherine Pembroke, who had never prepared her own meals, found herself peeling vegetables alongside kitchen maids who had once served her family. The adjustment was awkward for everyone involved, as neither the lady nor her former servants knew how to interact as equals. rather than as employer and employee. The breakthrough came when Lady Catherine admitted her complete ignorance about practical cooking and asked for instruction from women who had been cooking their entire lives. This reversal of traditional teaching relationships created opportunities for genuine connection that transcended their previous social boundaries. Lady Catherine learned not just how to prepare food, but how to listen to and learn from people she had previously regarded as invisible. The children who participated in these communal arrangements developed their own food culture that reflected their unique circumstances. They created elaborate games around gathering ingredients, turning the dangerous work of scavenging into adventures with rules and competitions. They invented songs and stories about the meals they shared, transforming simple food into celebrations that helped maintain morale during the darkest periods. 10-year-old Robert Morrison became legendary among the children for his ability to find edible plants and herbs in the most unlikely places. He had learned from his grandmother, who died early in the plague, which weeds could be eaten safely and which plants had medicinal properties. Robert taught other children to identify dandelion greens, wild garlic, and nettle leaves that could supplement their meager diets with essential nutrients. Robert's knowledge proved so valuable that adults began consulting him about plant identification, creating an unusual situation where children became teachers and adults became students. The reversal of traditional learning relationships reflected the broader social upheaval created by the plague, where survival skills mattered more than social status or formal education. The preservation of food during plague times required techniques that pushed the boundaries of existing knowledge. Without reliable access to salt or proper storage facilities, people had to develop new methods for keeping food edible in conditions that would normally guarantee spoilage. Sarah Whitman, who had inherited her husband's small grocery shop, became an expert in improvised preservation techniques that kept food safe for weeks longer than should have been possible. Sarah discovered that the smoke from certain types of wood not only masked the smell of decay, but actually slowed the spoilage process. She began smoking vegetables and even bread in makeshift structures built from salvaged materials, creating a preservation method that allowed families to store food for extended periods without refrigeration or proper root cellars. Her experiments with fermentation produced beverages that were not only safe to drink, but actually provided nutrition when other sources were scarce. Sarah's fermented vegetable drinks became popular throughout her district, providing vitamins and probiotics that helped people maintain their health when their diets consisted mainly of bread and whatever protein they could find. The knowledge Sarah developed through desperate experimentation proved so valuable that people traveled from distant neighborhoods to learn her techniques. She began teaching preservation workshops in her shop, passing on methods that would continue to be used long after the plague ended. Her innovations represented a form of practical science that emerged from necessity rather than formal education, proving that crisis could accelerate learning in ways that normal circumstances never could. The wine and ale trade during the plague created its own unique economy based on very different priorities than normal commerce. When people expected to die at any moment, the value of alcohol shifted from luxury to necessity, not for nutrition, but for the temporary escape it provided from overwhelming fear and grief. Thomas Hartwell had been a wine merchant, serving London's wealthy elite before the plague destroyed his customer base. Rather than abandon his profession, Thomas adapted his business to serve the psychological needs of survivors who desperately wanted to forget their circumstances for a few hours each day. He began mixing wines and ales with herbs that were rumored to have medicinal properties, creating beverages that offered both intoxication and the hope of protection from disease. Thomas's establishment became a gathering place where people could share their fears and sorrows with others who understood their experiences. The alcohol loosened tongues that had been constrained by the need to appear strong, allowing people to express grief and terror that they had been suppressing for months. These conversations, lubricated by Thomas's carefully crafted drinks, became a form of group therapy that helped survivors process trauma they had no other way to address. But Thomas's tavern also attracted people whose response to crisis was less healthy. Gamblers who wagered their families' remaining resources on card games and dice. Desperate individuals who drank themselves into unconsciousness rather than face another day of uncertainty. People who used alcohol to fuel anger and violence that made already dangerous situations even more volatile. Thomas found himself serving as both barkeeper and counselor, trying to provide the comfort that alcohol could offer while preventing the destruction it could cause. He developed elaborate systems for monitoring his customers' consumption, cutting off people who drank too much while still providing the social connection and temporary relief that kept people sane during impossible circumstances. The meat trade during plague years created some of the most morally complex situations that survivors faced. When livestock died from disease or neglect, when pets were abandoned by fleeing families, when the normal sources of protein disappeared, people had to make decisions about what they were willing to eat to stay alive. William Bradford had been a respectable butcher before the plague, serving quality cuts to middle-class families who could afford fresh meat several times a week. As his usual suppliers disappeared and his customer base dwindled, William faced choices that challenged every professional standard he had maintained throughout his career. William began accepting animals that would never have met his previous standards. Livestock that had died from unclear causes, pets that had been abandoned when their owners fled, wild animals that people brought him after desperate hunting expeditions in London's parks and surrounding countryside. He developed techniques for determining which questionable meat was safe to eat and which should be refused, becoming an expert in food safety under conditions that no textbook had ever addressed. His shop became a place where people brought animals they couldn't bear to eat themselves, but couldn't afford to waste. William would butcher beloved pets for families who wept as they made the transaction, understanding that these animals represented the difference between survival and starvation. He never charged for these services, recognizing that the families were already paying the highest possible price by sacrificing companions they loved. But William also discovered that crisis could reveal unexpected sources of protein that people had never considered before. He learned to prepare rats and pigeons in ways that made them not just edible, but actually appetizing. He developed techniques for using every part of an animal, creating nutritious meals from organs and bones that would normally have been discarded. His expertise in utilizing unconventional protein sources made him invaluable to his community, but it also burdened him with knowledge he wished he didn't possess. William never forgot the taste of desperation that flavored every meal during those months, and he carried the memories of the moral compromises he had made long after normal food supplies returned to London. The dairy products available during the plague came from sources that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. When cows died or were slaughtered for meat, when commercial dairies collapsed, when the usual supply chains disappeared, people had to find creative alternatives to obtain the milk and cheese that had been staples of their diets. Elizabeth Morrison had kept a few goats behind her small house in Suffolk, initially as a hobby that provided fresh milk for her family. When the plague isolated her neighborhood from outside suppliers, Elizabeth's goats became the primary source of dairy products for dozens of families. She found herself managing what was essentially a small-scale dairy operation that served customers who had never imagined drinking goat milk. Elizabeth's success with goats inspired other survivors to experiment with unconventional dairy sources. People began keeping rabbits not just for meat, but for the small amounts of milk they could provide. Some desperate families even attempted to milk dogs, though this proved both impractical and dangerous. The experimentation revealed how little most people understood about where their food actually came from, and how dependent they had become on complex supply systems they had never questioned. The cheese-making knowledge that Elizabeth possessed became incredibly valuable when normal preservation methods were unavailable. She taught neighbors how to turn milk into cheese that could last for weeks without spoilage, providing protein that remained safe to eat long after fresh milk would have become dangerous. Her small house became a centre of dairy production that supplied her entire district. But Elizabeth's success also created responsibilities she had never anticipated. When her goats became sick, entire families faced malnutrition. When predators killed one of her animals, the loss affected not just her household, but everyone who depended on the milk those animals provided. Elizabeth found herself carrying the nutritional welfare of her community on her shoulders, a burden that she bore willingly, but that sometimes felt overwhelming. The wild food that people learned to gather during the plague expanded London's residents' understanding of what constituted edible plants and how to find nutrition in unexpected places. When gardens were abandoned, when crops failed, when normal vegetables became unavailable, people had to learn to identify and prepare foods that grew wild in urban environments. Martha Henley had grown up in the countryside before moving to London, and her childhood knowledge of wild plants suddenly became invaluable when cultivated food sources disappeared. Martha began leading foraging expeditions into London's parks and commons, teaching other survivors to identify edible plants that most city dwellers had never noticed. Her lessons covered not just what could be eaten safely, but how to prepare wild foods to make them palatable and nutritious. Martha showed people how to boil acorns to remove their bitterness, how to prepare nettle leaves to eliminate their sting, and how to find the tender parts of plants that seemed entirely inedible to inexperienced foragers. The foraging expeditions became social events that provided not just food, but community connection and purposeful activity during days that might otherwise have been consumed by fear and despair. People who had been strangers before the plague formed friendships while searching for dandelion greens and wild onions. Children learned to identify plants alongside adults, creating shared knowledge that bonded families and neighborhoods together. But Martha's foraging lessons also revealed how much urban living had disconnected people from the natural sources of their sustenance. Many adults had to learn from scratch how to distinguish between edible and poisonous plants, knowledge that their rural ancestors would have considered basic survival skills. The plague forced a reconnection with nature that was both practical and profound. The cooking techniques that developed during plague times emphasized maximum nutrition from minimal ingredients, creating a cuisine of scarcity that was surprisingly sophisticated and flavorful. When traditional recipes became impossible because ingredients were unavailable, cooks had to improvise methods that could create satisfying meals from whatever they could find. Catherine Morris had worked in the kitchen of a wealthy household before the plague, where she had learned to prepare elaborate dishes that required dozens of ingredients and precise timing. When she found herself cooking for a household of plague survivors with access to only basic staples, Catherine had to completely reimagine her approach to food preparation. Catherine discovered that techniques designed for luxury cooking could be adapted to make simple ingredients more interesting and nutritious. She learned to create complex flavors by layering basic seasonings, to develop satisfying textures by combining different cooking methods, and to present humble ingredients in ways that made meals feel special rather than merely functional. Her innovations included methods for stretching small amounts of meat into satisfying stews, techniques for making bread more nutritious by incorporating wild plants and herbs, and ways of preparing vegetables that preserved their nutritional content while making them more digestible. Catherine's cooking became legendary in her neighborhood for its ability to transform scarcity into abundance. But Catherine's success as a crisis cook also taught her lessons about the relationship between food and community that she carried forward long after the plague ended. She learned that sharing meals was about more than nutrition. It was about creating connection and maintaining hope. The techniques she developed during the plague continued to influence her cooking throughout her life, making her meals more creative and her approach to hospitality more inclusive. The preservation of food traditions during the plague required conscious effort from survivors who understood that cultural knowledge could be lost forever if it wasn't actively maintained. When grandmothers died, when families were scattered, when normal social occasions disappeared, the recipes and techniques that had been passed down through generations were in danger of vanishing entirely. Mary Whitfield made a deliberate decision to document the cooking knowledge of elderly women in her neighborhood before it could be lost. She spent hours interviewing survivors who remembered traditional recipes, writing down not just ingredients and methods, but the stories and occasions associated with different dishes. Mary's documentation project revealed how much cultural knowledge was embedded in food preparation. The recipes she recorded included not just cooking instructions, but information about which foods were appropriate for different seasons, celebrations, and life events. She learned about traditional remedies that used food as medicine, preservation techniques that had been developed over centuries, and the symbolic meanings associated with different ingredients and dishes. Her work created a written record of food culture that would otherwise have disappeared with the generation that carried it in their memories. Mary's recipe collection became a treasured document that families used to reconstruct their culinary traditions after the plague ended, providing continuity between the old world and the new one that emerged from the crisis. The success of Mary's project inspired similar efforts throughout London, as survivors recognized that preserving cultural knowledge was as important as preserving human life. These documentation efforts created archives that captured not just recipes, but the entire social context of food preparation, including the songs people sang while cooking, the stories they told while eating, and the rituals that surrounded different meals. The seasonal rhythms of food production and consumption took on new meaning during the plague, as people learned to align their eating habits with the natural cycles that determined what was available at different times of year. When artificial preservation and long-distance transportation disappeared, survivors had to rediscover the connection between seasons and sustenance that urban living had obscured. The spring of 1666 brought wild greens and early vegetables that seemed like miracles to people who had survived the winter on stored grains and preserved meat. Robert Ashford, who had learned foraging from Martha Henley, organized neighborhood expeditions to gather the first edible plants that appeared as the weather warmed. These spring gathering expeditions became celebrations that marked not just the return of fresh food, but the community's survival through another winter. People who had endured months of scarcity together now shared in the abundance that nature provided, creating bonds that connected them to both the natural world and each other. The summer brought opportunities for preserving food that would sustain people through the following winter, creating an annual cycle of abundance and scarcity that required careful planning and community cooperation. Gardens that had been abandoned during the worst of the plague were reclaimed and replanted by groups of neighbors who shared both the work and the harvest. The autumn harvest became a community-wide effort that involved everyone regardless of their previous experience with agriculture. Children learned to help with picking and processing. Adults shared knowledge about preservation techniques, and elderly survivors provided guidance based on memories of pre-urban food systems. But the seasonal approach to eating also revealed how much people had gained and lost during their plague experiences. They had rediscovered connections to natural cycles and community cooperation that urban life had eroded. They had learned skills and developed resilience that would serve them throughout their lives. But they had also sacrificed the convenience and variety that complex food systems had provided, and many aspects of their new relationship with food required constant effort and attention that had previously been unnecessary. The winter months remained challenging even after the plague ended, as people had learned to associate cold weather with increased mortality and food scarcity. The psychological impact of winter on plague survivors required conscious effort to overcome, as memories of desperate hunger and impossible choices could be triggered by the first frost or the shortened days that marked the approaching season. Elizabeth Thornton, who had lost 3 children during the winter of 1665, found that each subsequent winter brought back the grief and terror she had experienced during those months. The sight of bare trees and empty gardens, the smell of wood smoke from heating fires, even the taste of preserved foods could transport her back to the time when every day had been a struggle for survival. Elizabeth's solution was to consciously create new associations with winter that emphasized comfort and security rather than scarcity and death. She established rituals around food preparation that celebrated the season rather than merely enduring it. She organized gatherings with other survivors that transformed winter evenings from times of lonely fear into occasions for community connection and mutual support. Her approach helped other survivors develop their own strategies for managing the psychological challenges that seasonal changes could trigger. People learned to prepare not just physically for winter, but emotionally, acknowledging that certain times of year would always carry difficult memories while creating new experiences that could provide comfort and hope. The food culture that emerged from London's plague years represented a unique blend of desperate innovation and conscious preservation, practical necessity and community celebration. The techniques and relationships that had been forged during the crisis continued to influence how people approached food and eating long after normal supply chains had been restored and traditional social patterns had resumed. The communal kitchens evolved into neighborhood gathering places that continued to serve meals and foster community connection. The preservation techniques developed during scarcity continued to be used during abundance, providing food security and reducing waste. The foraging knowledge gained during desperate times became a source of variety and nutrition that enriched people's diets, even when conventional foods were readily available. Most importantly, the crisis had taught London survivors that food was about more than nutrition. It was about community, continuity, and hope. The meals shared during the darkest months had provided not just physical sustenance, but emotional comfort and social connection that had been essential to survival. The lessons learned about cooperation, creativity, and resilience in the face of scarcity became permanent features of London's food culture that distinguished it from other cities that had never faced such extreme challenges. The children who had learned to find nutrition in wild plants, who had participated in communal cooking, who had watched adults make impossible choices about what to eat and what to save, carried forward an understanding of food that was both more practical and more profound than previous generations had possessed. They knew how to survive on very little, but they also understood how much food could contribute to community building, cultural preservation, and the maintenance of hope during difficult times. As London entered the 1670s, the food systems that had emerged from plague necessity had become permanent features of the city's culture. The networks of cooperation, the techniques of preservation, the knowledge of alternative sources, and the understanding of food's social importance had all been integrated into normal life in ways that made London more resilient and more connected than it had been before the crisis struck. The markets bustled with activity that reflected both the restoration of traditional commerce and the continuation of innovations born from necessity. Vendors sold conventional products alongside wild foods that had been discovered during foraging expeditions. Customers practiced preservation techniques they had learned during scarcity, even when abundance was available. The relationships between buyers and sellers retained the personal connection and mutual support that had been essential during the crisis. The taverns continued to serve not just alcohol, but community connection, maintaining the atmosphere of mutual support that had made them gathering places during the darkest times. The communal kitchens had evolved into neighborhood institutions that provided meals for anyone who needed them, while fostering the social bonds that had proven essential to survival. Perhaps most remarkably, the food traditions that had been documented and preserved during the plague had been enriched rather than diminished by the crisis. The recipes that survivors had recorded included both ancient techniques and recent innovations, creating a culinary heritage that was more diverse and more resilient than what had existed before the plague struck. The London that emerged from the Great Plague had learned lessons about food, community, and survival that would influence the city's character for generations to come. The crisis had revealed both the fragility of complex systems and the remarkable human capacity for adaptation and cooperation when survival depended on working together. The legacy of London's plague years extended far beyond the immediate crisis, shaping the city's character in ways that would endure for centuries. By 1670, the children who had survived those dark months were becoming young adults with perspectives that set them apart from any generation before or since. They carried within themselves a unique understanding of human resilience that would influence every aspect of their adult lives. Anne Pemberton, who had been 11 when the plague struck, found herself at 18 serving as an unofficial counsellor to other young women in her neighbourhood. Her experiences caring for younger children during the crisis had taught her to read people's emotional needs with uncanny accuracy. She could sense when someone was struggling with grief they couldn't express, when fear was masquerading as anger, or when seemingly confident behaviour was hiding deep insecurity. Anne's small room above her guardian's shop became a gathering place where young women would come to share problems they couldn't discuss with their families. Her ability to listen without judgment, combined with practical wisdom, gained through impossible circumstances, made her invaluable to peers who were navigating the normal challenges of young adulthood while carrying the psychological weight of their plague experiences. But Anne's role as counsellor also revealed the persistent effects of trauma on survivors who appeared to have recovered completely. Young women who seemed perfectly normal during the day would confess to Anne that they couldn't sleep through the night without checking door locks multiple times. Others admitted to hoarding food under their beds, despite living in households with well-stocked pantries. Some described panic attacks triggered by the smell of herbs or the sound of church bells that reminded them of plague times. Anne developed what she called memory exercises to help her friends distinguish between past danger and present safety. She would have them describe their current surroundings in detail, focusing on evidence of security and normalcy that contradicted their fearful memories. She taught them breathing techniques that could interrupt panic attacks, and she helped them create what she termed safety rituals that provided comfort when traumatic memories became overwhelming.